Buonasera, good evening, and thank you for joining us at this event, organized by the Slovene Research Institute, SLORI, in the framework of the Science in the City Festival, the ESO Festival, that is being held in Trieste in these days, in September 2020. The ESO Festival is primarily a hard science festival, therefore dedicated to natural sciences. And this is the only event dedicated to the so-called soft sciences or social sciences. As the president of its management board, I feel deeply grateful that the Slovenian Research Institute has been given the honor and responsibility to hold the only social science event of this festival, which is, I think, a very humbling recognition, not only of the work carried out by the colleagues at the Institute, but also recognition of the role played by the Slovenian community in this area, in Trieste, in a town that can boast centuries of multicultural life and where multiculturalism represents the essence of the town spirit. Although we are adhering to the guidelines of ESOF, and most of our viewers will be following us online, we wanted to hold this event here, at this particular venue that was visited by two heads of states only a couple of months ago, in honor of the remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the burning of the Narodni Dom, the symbolic national house of the Slovene community in Trieste. Today's event has the same name as this book, A Community in the Heart of Europe, which has been published recently. The volume was co-edited by colleagues at the SLORI and by the British publishing house Cambridge Scholars Publishing. This book represents the English version of the previously published Italian and Slovene versions, Una comunità nel cuore dell'Europa, Gli Sloveni in Italia dal crollo del muro di Berlino alle sfide del Terzo Millennio, and Skupnost v središču Evrope, Slovenci v Italiji od padca Berlinskega zidu do izzivov tretjega tisočletja. The two volumes were published by Caroci Editore and Založništvo tržaškega tiska, respectively. The aim of this publication was to explore and explain to an international audience the developmental dynamics of the Slovene national minority in Italy from the fall of the Berlin Wall through the democratization of the Republic of Slovenia and its subsequent accession to the European Union until now. Therefore, the book examines the socio-economic changes experienced by the Slovene national community in Italy over the last 25 years. Nevertheless, since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, much has changed for national minorities in general and for the Slovene minority in particular. Today, we would like to explore the how and the why of these changes with two renowned experts in the field. Zaira Vidau, the president of the scientific board at the Slovene Research Institute and the co-editor of this volume, together with Norina Bogatec. And our second guest is Emma Lanchner from the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, formerly from the EURAC Academy in Bolzano, and she's also currently serving as the Italian member of the Advisory Committee of the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. Please welcome our guests Zaira Vidau and Emma Lanchner. We have to wait for Emma to join us. Great. Hi, Emma.
Hello.
Okay. Emma is joining us from her holiday, so we have to be very grateful to her for taking the time to come at this event. Maybe we should start from this, from our local perspective, and I would maybe start with a question to Zaira. If we start from the book, mainly from the introductions of the book, they seem to point out that the fall of communism and the processes of European integration were crucial in normalizing the situation on the Slovene-Italian border, therefore creating a positive context for the development of the Slovene minority in Italy. But today, speaking from a COVID-19 perspective, the reality depicted in the book of an integrated cross-border region seems nearly surrealistic to me. What are your thoughts about it? How has the pandemic influenced the integration of the Slovene-Italian cross-border region? And what was the impact of COVID-19 on the Slovene community living here in Friuli Venezia Giulia?
Yes, lep večer, dober večer tudi z moje strani. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for being here with us. Yes, for sure, there were three factors, three socio-political processes that lead to a normalization of the interethnic relations in this border area between Italy and Slovenia. As you said, the fall of the Berlin Wall first, the independence of Slovenia, and then the processes of EU integration. Thus, this sudden closing of the border due to the pandemic, which happened, let's say, in few days, was for the Slovene minority in Italy especially something that led again to an artificial deepening of differences between people living along this border. Having first, let's say, Italian citizens or us seen as dangerous, as again some kind of enemies, because the pandemic spread first here in Italy, while now the dangerous and the enemies are, for instance, Croatians in this moment and partially also, let's say, Slovenes in Slovenia. So concerning the cross-border integration on this Italian-Slovene border, this integration is seen basically in everyday cross-border mobility, which is very high for work, education at various levels, and also for cross-border residential mobility, which means that people live on one side of the border and then go to work and have their social relations on the other side of the border. Also, many members of the Slovene community in Italy, for instance, decide to live in Slovenia and keep their jobs and lives or bring their children to schools, let's say, on the Italian side of the border. And thus the closing of the border because of the pandemic affected basically these daily cross-border migrants. So the questions which I also pose at this, let's say today, is also if this sudden closing of the border, and which was very strict at the beginning, if really prevented coronavirus entering, for instance, Slovenia. As we saw there, basically in Slovenia, the first cases came from people who traveled in, let's say, COVID-affected areas, so kind of tourists that came back home, while this, let's say, Primorska region, so the border region with Italy actually had, let's say, a low level of cases. And so we should ask ourselves if this closing, such strict closing of the border was really useful, and for what was useful for, and if it was a kind of false solution to a false problem. Of course, this is a question, and I think we will also, as Institute, kind to find, let's say, some answers in next months. Actually, we should have seen, in my opinion, more cooperation between local institutions on the border area. We saw that this cross-border integration between, on the institutional level, and especially among, let's say, regional governments, for instance, municipalities along the borders, the region government, and so on, did not work as it should work. And also because the border question is still just a matter of the central government, so it's a matter of Rome and Ljubljana, and these central governments are many times, let's say, very far from the real needs that we have, let's say, on the border area. Also another point that I would like to highlight is that in our book we also argue that the fact of living in two different states for Slovenes in Italy and Slovenes in Slovenia made already in last decades Slovenes in Italy kind of different from Slovenes in Slovenia, for instance, concerning cognitive models, values, and other characteristics, as of course they lived in two different socioeconomic context, political context, and two different administrative systems. So the question is if this pandemic actually deepened this gap between Slovenes in Italy and towards their kin state, so towards Slovenia, affecting also their identity as minority members and as members of the whole, let's say, Slovenian community. Another question, did the pandemic create among members of the minority, of the Slovenian minority, maybe more solidarity with other citizens in Italy due to the fact that Italy actually gives me health services and actually helps me with financial and other supports if I'm at home due to the lockdown or if I lose my job due to the pandemic. And also another question, which was actually the psychological effect of the closing of the border on minority members, as in a kind of very tough crisis situation. We saw kind of our kin state closing the border, and maybe we would expect more solidarity.
Thank you very much, Zaira. I think that you raised a lot of very interesting questions. Maybe, Emma, if you could join us a little bit. So Zaira gave us this picture of the impact of pandemic on the Slovene minority in Italy. Can you maybe tell us something about what do you think was the impact of the pandemic on other similar minorities in Europe? For example, I don't know, Germans in South Tyrol, but also the Danish-German border. It's very interesting for us because the situation of the minorities there, it's very similar to our border situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to this event, and it's a pleasure also to join you via this form of communication. I hope everything is working well with the Skype, etc. But to answer your question, so yeah, what was the impact of the pandemic on similar minorities in Europe? So I would say, first of all, the pandemic has had very different impacts on the different minorities depending on their pre-pandemic situation, let's say. So those minorities, I would say, that were well off already before the pandemic, they were suffering, of course, also from the disease and all the consequences, but at probably much lesser levels than those minorities that were already marginalized. We have seen that in many different fora already that what the pandemic actually did was simply highlighting the problems that many minorities were already facing before the outbreak of this disease. One example could, for instance, be, so what was the level of use of the minority language in relation to public administration? And of course, now during the pandemic, it was very difficult to provide information in minority language about the pandemic and about the measures taken against it, also in minority languages. And the Committee of Experts also of the Language Charter of the Council of Europe has already raised the awareness about the fact that in many European countries there was too little information in minority language about the pandemic. Then, of course, another issue that is important for these kind of situations is how the healthcare system works, how accessible it is in minority languages, and in this particular border situation, this is of course also a question, do the healthcare systems also cooperate across the borders? And probably one example here from South Tyrol that I can report from is that during the height of the pandemic, patients from South Tyrol were also transported to the university clinic in Innsbruck in Austria. So there was this kind of cooperation also taking place. And of course, minorities, we always speak about minorities living in border regions, that they also have the capacity of working as a kind of a bridge builders and of enhancing also this cooperation. And again, an example from here, from South Tyrol, when it comes of course, also due to the breakdown of the possibility of crossing the border, at least for certain periods, therefore the economic impact must not be neglected, not only because of the cross-border traffic, but simply as an effect of the pandemics as such. I have heard data from the Islands, for instance, where the unemployment rate was had triplified during the height of the pandemic. So even in regions that are normally economically relatively well off, the measures that were to be taken due to the pandemic, they hit the economy and thus also the minorities living in such border regions tremendously. And you were mentioning also the Danish-German border. So as far as I know, Germany was taking an approach that was not a uniform approach, basically, for all its borders with neighboring countries, but depending on the health situation across the border. So, for instance, there were periods where the border between Denmark and Germany, the border was closed, while the Belgian-German border was open. So it was a matter of seeing how the health situation was across the border, and on that basis, then a decision on whether the border traffic was allowed or not was taken, without really taking into consideration the repercussions on minority communities living there. Or maybe to make another example, of another border minority or minority living in a border region is the one on the Hungarian-Romanian border. So as we know, there is a very sizable Hungarian-speaking minority living in Romania, and initially Hungary completely closed the border and no border crossing was possible. But at some point it was due to also the lobbying by the Hungarian party in Romania that tried to lobby with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hungary that there is a more relaxed border regime, basically for those who had to commute for working purposes every day. And in the end, that was also made possible so that also those people working across the border could go to their workplace. So it took a while, probably in some regions, to realize that it's not simply possible to close the border and that's it, but that there is so much life going on across the border that individual solutions had to be found. So maybe so much for now.
Thank you, Emma. So one of the crucial issues that you both mentioned seems to be the border. Zaira, you said before that the strict closure of the border, it was a false solution to a false problem. And I was wondering, how has the Slovene minority reacted to the closing of the border imposed by Slovenia? Has it changed, in your opinion, the relationship between the minority and the king state? And maybe more importantly, how did the media report about the border, both on the Italian side and in Slovenia, if you know, perhaps?
Yes, so of course during the strict lockdown, when we saw the border closed with Slovenia, as members of the minority community, we kind of course accepted the situation as it was motivated by the health emergency. But let's say that some elements probably were very disturbing. For instance, episodes where some local mayor of a local municipality ordered, for instance, to fill up with big stones the off-road border points used mainly by local cross-border farmers, cyclists, runners, and hikers, in order to prevent them entering Slovenia and thus bring them the disease. And this seemed to us a bit of exaggerated and maybe we can also say ridiculous. I have to say that the Slovene organizations in Italy at that time appealed to Slovenian government and to Slovenian institutions to open as soon as possible the border. They highlighted the needs of cross-border daily migrants, the needs of the minority members, community members. At a certain point, some Slovene representatives from Italy also proposed some kind of differentiation concerning the crossing of the border for local residents along the border, but mainly, let's say, the state-centered strategies prevailed. So it was very, let's say, this kind of communication was kind of a hard one. Concerning the media, just briefly, for sure media, minority media on both sides of the borders reported, in my opinion, very well what was going on, especially with the border and the pandemic. Maybe we can say Primorski Dnevnik was very active in this field, also from ISTA, some journalists on Radio Capodistria, Radio Koper Capodistria. During the lockdown myself, for instance, I had an interview from a journalist from Radio Koper Capodistria, and she asked me how was going on my life during the pandemic, what do I think about the closing of the border, and let's say my opinion concerning what was going on. And thus my perception is that minority media in this border area were for sure prepared and motivated to talk about this closing of the border, about the pandemic and the problems that it created for local residents, also from this, let's say, more socio-political perspective, not just as a problem which is just connected with just health emergency, but also from this broader socio-political perspective.
Thank you. Emma, from what you said before, I think that you offered quite some examples of good cooperation that was established after the closing of several borders. I was wondering if what's your opinion about the long-term effect of these closures? You said that at a certain point they realized that they cannot simply close the border, but that certain arrangements needs to be made because there are people who are used to cross the border daily for different reasons. But do you think it will have a long-term impact on, how people think, how minorities think? Will they decide to live on one side of the border more than when they will be looking for housing or jobs? Will they also take into account again the issue of the border and that it can be closed again or not? It's a very difficult question, but
I think for many of the questions that we have to ask ourselves now in this, let's say, it's not really an aftermath. I don't think that it's already an aftermath of the pandemic. We are still facing a very interesting fall and winter, I guess. But I think very much will depend on how this next season will look like. Also, when later on we will probably speak also about the issue of education. I guess the long-term consequences, I think, thus far will not be so serious that people would take this possibility of borders closing, or this likelihood that borders might close again in case the pandemic should increase again, would take this into consideration when deciding whether they live on one side of the border or the other. But I think, nevertheless, that this experience which we have had now during this spring teaches us a lot, and I think it's much more important now to take a step back probably and reflect over what have we learned from the experience of this spring. So first of all, and that's actually one of, I think, the most important points that we have learned, is that it is important to involve national minorities in living in border regions in decisions about the details of the implementation of border closures. So like we were mentioning those examples where probably initially there was just a closing of the borders without taking into consideration at all how this will impact the lives of everyone in the end living in that border region. There's, I mean, of course, also majority members of the majority population might be involved in this cross-border commuting and trade and etc. So I think to involve the people living in these border areas when deciding about the details of border closures, I think is very important. And I think what we have also learned in this of whether that border, that particular border will be closed or not. And I think it was also one of the reasons why in this initial phase, probably people here in South Tyrol were also a bit disappointed by the King State, because the border was closed, and in particular when it comes to the very important issue of tourism, for instance. There was this reproach towards Austria, that Austria was interested in keeping German and Austrian tourists for itself, and therefore the borders were closed until the middle of June, and of course that was a big loss for the tourism in South Tyrol. And I think the closing of the border at the Brenner is always a sensitive issue. And I think it was even less understood because the figures in South Tyrol were comparatively low if you compare it to some other regions in Italy. And also this fact that no differentiation between a region where there was a relatively modest outbreak of the pandemic and other Italian regions was made. So I think initially there was this sense of disappointment also vis-à-vis the King State. But as I mentioned, with all those examples, then later on, with this cooperation in the health system, with the transport of masks, but later on it was also possible then, of course, for students from South Tyrol to go back to Innsbruck to take their exams, etc. So I think kind of a modus vivendi could be found. But another thing that this pandemic taught us was how important it is that the minority protection is not outsourced to the King State. So basically that the minority, it's the responsibility of the home state to take care of the minorities living on its territory, exactly because of the likelihood or the problems that could arise if borders should all of a sudden be closed again. And of course, the whole debate about closing of borders and the pandemic, etc., has also shown us other examples of King State activism in some countries in Europe. One example that I could make here is Hungary again. So that was probably not the best practice when I was speaking before about how the border regime was arranged between Hungary and Romania. I think it was a very good, a very positive example how they dealt with this issue. But then again, the Hungarian Fidesz government decided to extend some financial support and also support in terms of medical equipment, etc., to the Hungarians living outside its borders, and that was felt by some of the opposition parties that it's important now also to make sure that the Hungarians are supplied with the necessary medical equipment. And then the reaction was immediately, yeah, well, the Hungarians outside the border, they belong to our nation, and it was put nearly as if the opposition members did not belong to the nation. So that caused, of course, also friction within Hungary, that caused also some resentments from the side of the Romanian state, where again the Hungarian state extended basically the borders of the ethnic nation, in any case beyond its legal borders, and therefore it's such a period of also this pandemic has also provided the ground for King state activism, which is in general to be seen relatively critical. So I don't know. Your initial question was the long-term consequences.
Yeah, Emma, I think that you gave us a very exhaustive answer, and I was just wondering about the media. Do you think that maybe the media and the minority media in particular played any role in, letting the countries know? Because as if I understood you correctly, the point is that at the beginning, when their countries panic, they centralized the decision making and they basically closed the borders. Then actually they realized that this is not a long-term solution, and they are now starting to think about differentiation and trying to find different regimes. So I was wondering if you think that there was a role that the media played in this respect, in terms of raising awareness about the problems that minorities have and people living across the border have.
Definitely, I don't think it really, media in general play, of course, a role in raising awareness, and as long as they provide accurate information, etc., they are crucial also in order to form opinion played actually decisive role in reshaping these border regimes. I don't think that they were really playing a decisive role. I think it was more taking place at the level of minority parties, probably lobbying with their counterparts across the borders, and also municipalities, and in our case in South Tyrol, for instance, was definitely also the cooperation between the Länder. It was more at the level of political players.
Okay, thank you. I would like to go back to something you said before, Emma. You said that the pandemic highlighted the problems that were there before. And Zaira, if I go back to our book, the book tackles the issue of education in public schools with Slovene as the teaching language in Italy. And we know that there are quite some issues, some problems discussed in the book. I was wondering if, besides those discussed in the book, are there any other issues or sore points that the pandemic has revealed or pointed to in the field of education?
Yes, for sure. This, let's say, pandemic highlighted the question of the use of the Slovene language in these schools from various points of view. I would like here to use the data that were just collected by my colleague and also the co-editor of the book, Norina Bogatec. She has just finished research on the digital school among the Slovene schools in Italy during the lockdown. And she interviewed with a questionnaire parents, children, and teachers. And it emerged that, of course, there were some general problems concerning this online schooling. For instance, the quality of learning, the professionality of a single teacher, the house management of children and smart work, the impact of such schooling on social and psychological behavior of children and young. But also two questions arise that are specific, let's say, for a school that is where minority language is taught. First, I would say the availability and use of softwares and apps in Slovene language. This is something that emerged from the research that my colleague made, Norina Bogatec. And the second question is related especially to those families which are, let's say, Italian-speaking families, but they decide to enroll their children to Slovene schools, and some of them highlighted that they would expect more linguistic support in Slovene language during the pandemic, because for them was, of course, more difficult to help children with homework and everything from home, not having the Slovene language at home.
Especially because I think that some of these children go to school that finishes at 4 p.m. So
yes,
they also do the homework usually at school. Yes,
and it happened that not going physically to the school, these children actually did not have any contact and any possibility to use the Slovene language, because they were actually at home and they don't have this language at home, for instance.
So the education of the Slovene minority was quite disrupted by the epidemics, and I think that there's a movement right now of, I would say, global conferences talking about this disruption of education, because it's not only a problem for minorities, but obviously for nations in general. Mm-hmm. So Emma, what kind of consequences does the disruption of education represent for national minorities in particular, let's say it this way? Is the situation of minorities comparable to the situation of majorities, or are there other hidden dark sides, like the ones that Zaira found out in the case of Slovenes in Italy? So are there other dark sides, might be more worrying side effects that need to be considered when we talk about education of minorities?
Yes, that's of course a very important question, and there's already going around the talk about the lost generation. And again, I think what I said before applies also to we can draw similarities. But of course, among the more vulnerable groups like Roma, I think the consequences can be really dramatic. Roma were already suffering from early dropouts at school or really learning problems, etc. So I think here it is really necessary to make sure that the situation will not repeat in the next academic year. But also differences probably, and Zaira mentioned this, was regarding the digital materials that were already available for different minority languages. And I think here maybe the distinction can be made between minority languages that do have a strong like background community, like for instance the German minorities in some countries. Again, I guess they were better off because the German language is a very much spoken language, and digital materials were probably already available. I just know from my daughter who goes to school in Graz, she was using the same learning app as her friends here in South Tyrol that go to a German language school. So here the apps, the learning apps that already existed, some digital materials probably already pre-existed, but in other cases, of course, that just need to be developed. And I think here the lesser used minority languages are obviously at a disadvantage, and there is of course the need to support them in the development of such digital material. And then of course in some countries we have seen also that the public broadcaster was also used to provide teaching, and in some countries, I know for instance of Croatia, no such services and teaching services were provided in the minority languages. I know from a colleague in Georgia where he reported apparently that also the television was used to provide teaching, and there they provided also in several minority languages. And here again, the Roma were of course amongst those that were in most of the cases also disregarded. But there again, the question is, what can we learn now from this experience of this last semester? And I think there is a developing understanding that digital education is coming along, or is coming as a supplement to traditional kinds of education. And of course, the older the learner, the better you can use also a digital approach. And I think we will see, or we will have to see, the development of educational online or digital education strategies in different countries, which start from, of course, providing internet access also to remote areas, etc., and to making sure that also the technical equipment is available at home. But of course, then also developing the curricula and developing the teaching materials in a digital form. And so I think also here we can draw something from the experience, and if such a digital learning environment is created, that could be used also in other circumstances, like in a country where a conflict erupts, where for other reasons education breaks down, or also for traveling communities. So I think what we make out of this pandemic or this digitalization push that we will probably see might also turn out to be a positive lesson, basically, from the pandemic.
Emma, I agree with you on this point. We discussed also in Slovenia, you know, that if these kind of digital materials are prepared, they could be used also, you know, when some of the children are really ill, you know, or are absent for long periods of time, and it could help them, you know, to continue with their studies and face less problems. If we try now to wrap up our discussion and maybe get a more holistic issue of where we stand and where we are going to be in the coming years. Zaira, despite all the challenges that we have talked about today, the book has a fairly positive outlook and gives the impression of Slovenes in Italy as a vibrant community. Now the pandemic has changed the context where the community lived and where it thrived. How do you think these changes will affect the development of the community in the future? and the whole Slovene-Italian cross-border region, taking now into the account, yes, the situation we had before, and also the effect of the pandemic.
Yes, I think here we have various aspects on how can it, let's say, have an impact on the long term. It is a question if it will affect the relations between the Slovene minority in Italy with the kin state, so with Slovenia, with the central government in Slovenia. As I said at the beginning, because of the management of the closing of the border, and let's say our minority was not very enthusiastic about, let's say, how it was managed at the beginning. And a question if we will feel even more farther Ljubljana from us than now, concerning our needs, our behaviors, and also concerning a kind of lack from the central government in Slovenia to see this area as a strategic area for the Slovenian country. So seeing a minority kind of part, let's say, of a strategy, not just something that has a cultural value, folkloristic value, but besides this also economic value, political value, and so on. Then a second question is how it will affect this daily cross-border mobility. So as I said at the beginning, this region is very well integrated because people live on one side of the border, have a job, and bring children to school on the other side of the border, and so on. So I'm asking myself if somebody today have to decide whether to buy a house in Slovenia or not, or whether to enroll children in Slovenia or not, what it will we do if the pandemic issue will affect also this kind of decision. So if we will see on long term a kind of, I don't want to say a lowering of the cross-border mobility, but maybe a kind of, how to say, slow, that it will be slower than it was now. Then, of course, the question is concerning also to Slovenian schools. As I said, in Slovenian schools we have also children from Italian-speaking families. So also here, an Italian family that maybe already decided to enroll their child to a Slovene school, what will they do now, as we have this digital school going on, and probably it will last partly also in the next years. Because as we saw, this digital school was more difficult to tackle for Italian families rather than to Slovenian families because of this linguistic support. And then, of course, a very important question, and the last but not the least for the Slovene community, is also financing of our organizations, institutions. We also have this issue in our book, and Sara Brezigar wrote something about that. So what it will happen with this public system of financing that the Slovene minority has nowadays because of the protection law from the 2001. We don't have actually now any news about it. We will see probably next year if the central government of the or the regional government will decide to kind of, let's say, reduce the financing because of this health emergency. And also, let's say, as a final thought, I would also to say this, that I think, as also Emma said, that the pandemic actually affects communities considering their socio-economic and political situation. So actually it's less relevant if we are a minority or majority member. It's relevant if we live in a region which is well developed, which have well health service, well public, let's say public schooling, and so on. And so also a question that I'm posing, what to do with the system of minority rights we have today, and this is also a question that I posed to Emma, in the sense that if this system of minority rights is still, let's say, useful for the situation in which we live now, or rather we should think about some rights that are not just, let's say, rights for a minority member, but a right, for instance, for a person that live in a region which is multicultural, multi-ethnic, which is a border region, and so on. And of course, this is is also a philosophical question, but it's something that I think it emerged also during this pandemic, because also today we heard that the issues we tackled with were, let's say, basically common issues with Italian-speaking people with whom we live in this area, not just specifically, let's say, Slovene minority issues.
So with this idea, you are already very close to the approach that the Slovenian state has to autochthonous minorities, the ethnically mixed area. No? So that's a really interesting notion. Emma, would you like to answer Zaira's questions?
Well, it's of course a difficult question, and I would not want to put the overall minority protection regime into doubt or question. But what we have definitely seen, and I think that's also something that has to be factored in the future, is that this pandemic has brought, the vulnerability of certain national minorities to the fore, but it has also brought to the fore that these vulnerabilities are basically rooted in structural problems. And they are often connected again to the socio-economic inequalities existing in the society. And here so those socio-economic inequalities exist, of course, not only vis-a-vis minority population, but also in the rest of the society. And probably they are sometimes more present in specific regions than in others. So in that sense, I think the governments, they have to address those socioeconomic problems that have also contributed to making the pandemic more of a problem for specific groups than for others. And here I wouldn't make a distinction between minority and majority. So therefore, I think addressing these issues for the states will be important. So prioritizing and protecting the economically vulnerable, no matter whether they belong to the minority or to the majority. So in that sense, I totally agree that probably we don't need to speak in minority-majority terms. But I think the whole minority protection system, of course, has its legitimacy, and all the problems that have been brought to the fore through the pandemic existed already before. So, and in that sense, I think it's now the task of the different governments to really get a good understanding of what the real repercussions on those vulnerable groups, including minorities, have been, and to really try to address them in order to avoid a similar, like similarly tremendous repercussions on those vulnerable groups as we witnessed them in this first wave of the pandemic. And I think the fields that need to be addressed, I think we touched on them throughout our discussion. The field of education is, of course, most obvious, and we discussed it. Of course, also the labor market. And there again, also national minorities, they are often amongst those more easily affected by the loss of the workplace. They are more sometimes working also in these jobs that are more exposed also in such times of emergency. We addressed also the question of the access to healthcare. Of course, it's important, the access to healthcare in minority language, but here I think it's also the matter we also discussed, so to what extent are healthcare systems cooperating also across borders. Then we have the phenomenon of hate speech and open racism that we could observe also in not only in the beginning but throughout the pandemic, where certain groups, sometimes it was minorities, national minorities, but also other vulnerable groups like LGBT, for instance, they were also scapegoated for spreading the pandemic. So I think there are several other groups that need particular protection as well. And I think one thing has also become quite clear, that the situation in refugee camps and Roma settlements, where it is basically impossible to maintain social distancing norms or healthcare advice, because it's simply
Thank you, Emma. Emma, do you think that the pandemic has changed the position of national minorities in Europe?
I think, I don't know, changed the position in the sense, as I mentioned just before, so the problems that minorities are facing have become more visible. And that, I think, can again be taken as a springboard in order to improve the situation, because all the problems that they are facing, and again, I mainly refer to those that have started from a socioeconomic and not so well off situation, because they were mainly affected by the pandemic. So in that sense, I think their problems have become more present. And in that sense, I think it's also now really on the stage to tackle these issues.
I was just wondering, when you were talking and Zaira was talking about the same subject, it seems to me that several times you tackled the same issue from two very different perspectives. For example, I remember when talking about the kin state, Zaira said that maybe the minority now feels that Ljubljana is farther than it was before, before the border were closed. And it was, maybe the minority felt a bit left out, or in this situation, while you tackled the same issue from the other perspective, and told us that there is a need for an enhanced protection of minorities from the states where the minorities actually live. So I think that during this discussion, you could see, that you basically tackled the same issue from two different points of view, and I think it always brings us back to what can we learn from this situation and how we will, develop in the next steps. I would like to thank you both for this discussion. I think that unfortunately our time is up, and we need to wrap up this incredibly interesting discussion. I hope that, unfortunately, we can't have a discussion with the public because Emma cannot hear you, but maybe after we wrap up this event, we can have some informal discussion among ourselves. So at this point, I would like to thank our two guests, Zaira Vidau and Emma Lanchner, for their insights. I think that they have given us an immense quantity of food for thought. And thank you also to all of you, to all the guests who are following us both here and the ones who are following us online from their comfortable couches at home. So thank you also to the ESOF organizers for this opportunity and to the colleagues at Slory for organizing this event. If anyone is interested in securing a copy of the book, it can be bought online from the publisher. Again, the publisher is Cambridge Scholars Publishing, and I think that there are some leaflets at the entrance that give you the right to a small discount when purchasing the book. So again, thank you very much, Emma, Zaira, and above all, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.